In a small but lively city, where life buzzed with energy and people moved to the rhythm of their daily routines, James Thompson was just another face in the crowd. Except, he wasn't. James was a man who stood out, not because of how he looked or dressed, but because of what he represented. Hard work, determination, and kindness were the pillars of his life. At 38 years old, James had climbed the ladder at one of the most respected tech companies in the region. He was now a senior manager, overseeing teams that developed cutting-edge software used nationwide. People admired him not only for his success but also for his humility. James lived a quiet life outside of work. He enjoyed long walks after sunset when the streets were calm and the world seemed to slow down. It gave him time to think, reflect, and recharge. But on this particular evening, something felt different. The air was heavy, as if it carried an invisible weight. James couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was just fatigue from a long day at the office. As he strolled through a quieter part of town, a shortcut he often took to avoid traffic, he noticed a police car slowly trailing behind him. At first, he didn't think much of it. Police cars were a common sight in any neighborhood, and James assumed the officer was simply patrolling the area. But then, without warning, the vehicle sped up and pulled over to the curb right next to him. Out stepped Officer Mark Harris, a man whose reputation preceded him. Known for his short temper and aggressive behavior, Harris had been the subject of numerous complaints over the years. Many accused him of targeting individuals based on race, though no formal charges ever stuck. To Harris, certain neighborhoods were problem areas, and anyone walking through them late at night was automatically suspicious, especially if they were black. That mindset governed his actions more often than not. Harris approached James with a scowl etched across his face. His hand rested on the holster of his gun, a subtle yet unmistakable sign of authority. "Hey you," he barked, his voice sharp enough to cut through the silence of the night. "Stop right there." James froze, startled by the sudden command. He turned to face the officer, confusion written all over his expression. "Is everything okay?" he asked politely, his tone calm despite the tension in the air. "What are you doing around here?" Harris demanded, ignoring James's question. His eyes narrowed as he studied the man standing before him. To Harris, James fit the profile of someone up to no good, a stereotype he clung to tightly, even when evidence suggested otherwise. "I'm just heading home," James replied, keeping his voice steady. "I work late sometimes, so I take this route to save time." But Harris wasn't satisfied. He crossed his arms and leaned closer, his demeanor growing more hostile. "You expect me to believe that? You don't live around here. What's your name?" "My name is James Thompson," he said, reaching into his pocket to pull out his wallet. "I can show you my ID." "Keep your hands where I can see them," Harris shouted, his hand now gripping the handle of his gun. His voice echoed through the empty street, startling a stray cat that darted into the shadows. James immediately stopped moving, raising his hand slightly to show he meant no harm. "I'm just trying to get my ID," he explained, his heart beginning to race. "I'm not doing anything wrong." But Harris wasn't listening. In his mind, James's attempt to retrieve his ID was a threat, an act of defiance. Without hesitation, the officer lunged forward, grabbing James by the arm and twisting it behind his back. Pain shot through James's body as Harris shoved him against the hood of the patrol car. "Don't resist," Harris growled, pressing harder until James winced. "You're under arrest." James struggled to make sense of what was happening. Arrested? For what? All he had done was walk home, yet here he was, pinned down by a man sworn to protect and serve. Fear gripped him, but so did anger. How could this be happening? Why wouldn't the officer listen? The sound of footsteps nearby caught both men's attention. A few curious neighbors had emerged from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Some stood silently watching the scene unfold, while others pulled out their phones to record the incident. One woman called out, "What's going on? He hasn't done anything." Harris ignored her, tightening his grip on James's wrists as he prepared to handcuff him. For James, each passing second felt like an eternity. His mind raced with questions. Would anyone believe him? Would this nightmare ever end? And most importantly, why was this happening to him? Little did either man know, their lives were about to intersect in ways neither could have predicted. As the handcuffs clicked shut around James's wrists, sealing his fate for the moment, the seeds of a shocking revelation were already being sown. But for now, all James could do was endure the pain and humiliation, hoping against hope that justice would prevail. This segment introduces the main characters and sets the stage for the conflict. It builds suspense and engages the reader by focusing on James's perspective and emotions, making the situation relatable and impactful. The night grew darker, both literally and figuratively, as James found himself trapped in a situation spiraling out of control. The cold metal of the handcuffs dug into his wrists, each movement sending sharp jolts of pain through his arms. Officer Mark Harris stood over him, his face flushed with anger and authority. To Harris, this was just another stop and frisk gone wrong, a routine part of his job. But for James, it was an unimaginable nightmare. "Get up," Harris barked, yanking James to his feet. The force of the pull made James stumble, but he managed to regain his balance. He tried to speak again, hoping reason might break through the officer's hostility. "Officer, please," James pleaded, his voice trembling. "I haven't done anything. I'm just trying to get home." Harris didn't respond. Instead, he shoved James toward the patrol car, ignoring the murmurs of disapproval from the small crowd that had gathered. Phones were still recording, capturing every moment of the confrontation. Some bystanders shouted protests, demanding to know why James was being treated this way. One man stepped forward, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "He was just walking. What's the problem?" he asked loudly. "Step back or you'll be next," Harris snapped, glaring at the man until he reluctantly retreated. His tone left no room for argument, and the crowd hesitated, unsure whether to intervene further. For James, their hesitation felt like abandonment. He looked around, searching for someone, anyone, who might help him. But all he saw were faces filled with pity, fear, or indifference. Once James was inside the patrol car, Harris slammed the door shut with unnecessary force. The sound echoed through the quiet street, punctuating the gravity of the moment. James sat stiffly on the hard, plastic seat, his mind racing. How could this have happened? Why wouldn't the officer listen, and where was he being taken? Each question piled onto the last, creating a whirlwind of anxiety and confusion. As the car pulled away from the curb, James caught one final glimpse of the people who had witnessed his arrest. A few continued filming, their phones glowing faintly in the darkness. Others simply watched, shaking their heads in disbelief. James wondered if the footage would matter, if anyone would believe his side of the story once the police report was filed. After all, how many times had similar incidents occurred only for the victims to be dismissed or ignored? At the station, things only got worse. Harris marched James inside, gripping his arm tightly as they entered the dimly lit building. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the walls. Officers glanced up briefly as they passed, but most quickly returned to their tasks, uninterested in yet another suspect brought in for questioning. James was led to a small holding area, where he was ordered to sit on a wooden bench while Harris processed him. The officer's demeanor hadn't softened. If anything, he seemed more agitated than before. He rifled through James's belongings, examining his wallet, phone, and keys with exaggerated suspicion. James watched silently, his frustration mounting with each passing second. Finally, Harris turned to face him. "All right, let's hear it," he said gruffly. "Why were you in that neighborhood?" For what felt like the 100th time, James repeated his explanation. "I was taking a shortcut, home. I work late nights sometimes, so I use that route to avoid traffic. That's all." "And we're supposed to believe that?" Harris sneered, tossing James's wallet onto the table. "You think I don't know your type? Walking around like you own the place?" "My type?" James interrupted, his voice rising despite his efforts to stay calm. "What does that even mean? I told you the truth." But Harris wasn't listening. He leaned in closer, his breath hot and stale. Listen here, buddy. You can play innocent all you want, but I've seen guys like you before. Sneaking around, causing trouble. Don't give me that "I'm just walking home" nonsense. James clenched his fists, fighting back tears of frustration. This wasn't fair. None of it was fair. Yet no matter how many times he tried to explain himself, Harris refused to hear him. It was as if the officer had already decided James was guilty, and nothing he said would change that. Hours dragged by, each minute feeling longer than the last. James requested to make a phone call, but his request was denied. He asked for water, but Harris ignored him. The isolation was suffocating, leaving James feeling powerless and alone. He replayed the events of the evening in his mind, searching for something, anything he could have done differently. Had he walked too fast? Too slow? Should he have avoided reaching for his ID? The questions swirled endlessly, offering no answers. Meanwhile, outside the station, word of the arrest began to spread. Social media played its part, as always. Someone uploaded a video of the incident, tagging local news outlets and community leaders. Comments poured in, ranging from outrage to disbelief. Among those watching the unfolding drama was Sarah Miller, one of James's colleagues at the tech company. She recognized her boss immediately and gasped in shock. "Oh my God, that's James," she exclaimed, showing the video to her husband. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through the comments. "This can't be happening. We need to tell someone." Without wasting a moment, Sarah called the office. By then, it was early morning and the CEO, Michael Carter, was already preparing for the day ahead. When Sarah explained what she had seen, Michael's expression darkened. "Are you sure it's him?" he asked, though deep down, he knew the answer. "Yes, it's definitely James," Sarah replied firmly. "We have to do something. Now." Michael wasted no time. He contacted the company's legal team and instructed them to reach out to the police department immediately. Meanwhile, Sarah alerted other employees, sparking a chain reaction of concern and action. Within hours, the entire organization was aware of James's predicament, and plans were underway to secure his release. Back at the station, Harris finally processed James's personal information. As he typed the name into the system, his eyes widened in shock. The screen displayed details confirming James's identity, including his position as a senior manager at the very company funding the police department's latest technology initiative. Harris froze, his stomach sinking as the realization hit him like a freight train. He had arrested his boss. Panic set in almost instantly. Harris scrambled to cover his tracks, deleting notes and altering reports in a desperate attempt to mitigate the damage. But it was too late. The evidence was undeniable, and the weight of his mistake pressed down on him like a ton of bricks. For the first time in his career, Harris felt truly afraid. This segment delves deeper into James's emotional turmoil and highlights the growing tension between him and Officer Harris. It also introduces key developments outside the station, setting the stage for the fallout to come. The narrative maintains suspense and keeps the reader engaged by alternating between James's perspective and the reactions of those working to help him. The weight of the situation pressed down on James like a suffocating blanket. Hours had passed since his arrest, and still, no one had listened to him or offered him any form of relief. The cold bench beneath him felt unyielding, its hard surface digging into his back as he sat slumped in exhaustion. His wrists throbbed from the tightness of the handcuffs, which remained firmly locked around them despite his repeated pleas for their removal. Every attempt to explain himself, to reason with Officer Harris, had been met with disdain, disbelief, or outright hostility. It was as if his words carried no meaning, as if he were invisible. James's mind raced with thoughts of despair. He wondered how long he would be held here, trapped in this sterile, fluorescent-lit room that seemed designed to strip away all sense of humanity. Was this what it felt like to lose control completely? To have your dignity stripped away by someone who refused to see you as an equal? Tears welled up in his eyes, but he blinked them back, unwilling to give Harris the satisfaction of seeing him break. Still, the emotions bubbling inside him were overwhelming. Anger, frustration, humiliation, and fear, all swirling together in a chaotic storm. Meanwhile, outside the station, the wheels of justice began turning faster than anyone could have anticipated. Sarah Miller, after alerting the CEO, Michael Carter, stayed glued to her phone, monitoring updates about James's arrest online. Social media had exploded with reactions to the incident, fueled by videos shared by witnesses. Comments ranged from outrage at the officer's behavior to expressions of solidarity with James. Some users pointed out the disturbing pattern of racial profiling evident in Harris's actions, while others called for accountability and reform within the police department. Michael Carter, meanwhile, wasted no time mobilizing resources. As CEO of the tech company where James worked, he understood the gravity of the situation, not only for James personally, but also for the organization as a whole. The company prided itself on promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion, and having one of its top executives arrested under such circumstances was unacceptable. Michael immediately convened an emergency meeting with senior leadership and the legal team to strategize next steps. "We need to act quickly," Michael said, his voice firm but calm. "This isn't just about James. It's about sending a message that we won't tolerate injustice, especially when it happens to one of our own." The legal team sprang into action, drafting letters to the police department demanding answers and threatening legal action if necessary. They also reached out to community advocacy groups, seeking support and amplifying James's story. Meanwhile, Michael personally called influential figures in the city, including local politicians and business leaders, urging them to speak out against the incident. Word spread rapidly, and soon, pressure mounted on the police department to address the controversy head-on. Back at the station, Officer Harris was unraveling. After discovering James's identity through the system, he realized the magnitude of his mistake. Arresting a high-ranking executive from the same company funding the police department's latest technology initiative was not just embarrassing, it was catastrophic. Harris knew that once news of this got out, his career would be over. Desperation clouded his judgment as he frantically tried to cover his tracks. Harris deleted notes from his report, altering details to make the arrest appear justified. He claimed James had resisted arrest and posed a threat, even though video evidence directly contradicted those claims. But deep down, Harris understood that his efforts were futile. The truth had already begun to surface, thanks to the bystanders, recordings, and social media posts. No amount of manipulation could erase what had happened. As the morning sun began to rise, casting soft light through the station's windows, James finally heard footsteps approaching his holding area. For a moment, hope flickered in his chest. Perhaps someone had come to help him. Perhaps this nightmare was nearing its end. But when the door opened, it was Harris standing there, looking more agitated than ever. "You're free to go," Harris muttered gruffly, avoiding eye contact as he unlocked the handcuffs. His hands trembled slightly as he handed James his belongings. "Just don't cause any trouble." James stared at him, incredulous. "Free to go?" he repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. "After everything you've done to me? Do you even realize how wrong this is?" Harris didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked away, leaving James alone in the hallway. Confusion washed over him as he gathered his things. Why was he being released now? What had changed? Before he could process it further, another officer approached, this one visibly more sympathetic. "Mr. Thompson, I'm sorry for what you've been through," the officer said quietly. "There's been some developments. Your employer has been in touch with us and they're sending someone to pick you up." The early morning air was crisp as James stepped out of the police station, his body stiff from hours spent sitting on the cold bench. Despite being released, he didn't feel free. The weight of what had happened still clung to him like a shadow, refusing to lift. His clothes were wrinkled, his tie loosened during the ordeal, and dark circles framed his eyes, a testament to the sleepless night he had endured. Standing under the pale glow of the streetlights outside the station, James took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. But the anger, humiliation, and disbelief swirling inside him made it hard to focus. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb, its headlights cutting through the dimness. The driver's side window rolled down, revealing Michael Carter, the CEO of the tech company where James worked. Michael's expression was a mix of concern and determination as he stepped out of the vehicle. "James," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Let's get you home." For a moment, James just stood there, unsure how to respond. He felt a strange mix of gratitude and resentment. Gratitude that someone had come for him, but resentment that it had taken this long. Finally, he nodded and climbed into the passenger seat without saying a word. As the car drove away from the station, James stared out the window, watching the city blur past in streaks of light and shadow. "Are you okay?" Michael asked after a few minutes of silence. His tone was gentle, but James could hear the underlying tension in his voice. This wasn't just about one man's arrest anymore. It was about the reputation of an entire organization and the fight for justice that lay ahead. "I don't know," James admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, I'm not hurt physically, but—" He trailed off, unable to find the right words to describe the emotional toll of the night. How could he explain the feeling of being treated like a criminal when all he'd done was walk home? How could he convey the sense of betrayal he felt? Not just toward Officer Harris, but toward a system that allowed such injustice to happen. Michael nodded, understanding more than James realized. "We're going to fix this," he said firmly. "Not just for you, but for everyone who's been treated this way, you have my word." Back at the police station, chaos reigned. News of James's arrest and his connection to the tech company had spread like wildfire. Officers whispered nervously in hallways, speculating about the fallout. Some defended Harris, claiming he was simply doing his job, while others criticized his reckless behavior, knowing full well the damage it could cause. Meanwhile, Harris himself sat in a corner of the break room, staring blankly at the wall. His hands trembled as he gripped a cup of coffee, his mind racing with thoughts of what would happen next. It didn't take long for the higher-ups to summon him. Captain Reynolds, a stern man in his 50s with a no-nonsense attitude, called Harris into his office. The door closed behind them with a soft click, but the tension in the room was palpable. Reynolds wasted no time getting to the point. "What the hell were you thinking?" he demanded, slamming a folder onto his desk. Inside were screenshots of social media posts, news articles, and witness statements, all condemning Harris's actions. "You arrested one of our biggest sponsors' top executives. Do you understand the implications of that?" Harris stammered, struggling to defend himself. "Sir, I thought he was suspicious. He matched the profile." "Profile?" Reynolds interrupted, his voice sharp. "What profile? Walking while black? That's not a crime, Harris. And now we're facing public backlash, lawsuits, and possibly losing funding because of your incompetence." Harris sank into the chair opposite. The captain, his face pale. "I didn't know who he was at first," he muttered weakly. "If I'd known." "But you did know," Reynolds snapped. "You saw his ID, ran his information, and still decided to double down instead of admitting your mistake. That's not ignorance, that's arrogance. And arrogance has consequences, as—" Harris left the office, suspended pending investigation. Whispers followed him down the hallway. Fellow officers avoided eye contact, unwilling to associate with someone whose career was clearly circling the drain. For the first time in his life, Harris felt truly alone. The power he once wielded as a badge-carrying authority figure now seemed hollow, replaced by shame and regret. Outside the station, protests began to form. Word of James's arrest had ignited outrage across the community, drawing people from all walks of life to demand accountability. Signs reading "Justice for James" and "End Police Brutality" dotted the crowd, while chants echoed through the streets. Local activists joined forces with national organizations, amplifying the call for reform. Social media played a crucial role, spreading awareness and rallying supporters far beyond the city limits. At the tech company headquarters, employees gathered in the main conference room to discuss the situation. Michael addressed the team, his tone resolute. "This isn't just about James. It's about standing up against systemic racism and abuse of power. We can't stay silent. We won't stay silent." The legal team worked tirelessly, filing formal complaints against Harris and the police department. They also reached out to advocacy groups, offering resources and support to amplify the voices calling for change. Meanwhile, Sarah and other colleagues organized fundraisers and awareness campaigns, ensuring that James's story wouldn't fade into obscurity. For James, the days that followed were a blur. Friends, family, and co-workers rallied around him, offering comfort and encouragement. Yet, despite their efforts, he couldn't shake the lingering trauma of the experience. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Harris's face, heard his harsh commands, felt the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into his skin. Sleep eluded him, and even simple tasks became overwhelming. One evening, as he sat alone in his apartment staring at the city lights, James made a decision. He couldn't let this incident define him, or worse, go unanswered. If anything positive was to come from this nightmare, it would be change. Real, lasting change. With renewed resolve, James began reaching out to advocacy groups, sharing his story and lending his voice to the movement for police reform. He spoke at rallies, wrote op-eds, and met with lawmakers, using his platform to shine a light on the injustices faced by countless others. Though the road ahead would be long and difficult, James knew he wasn't walking it alone. Together they would fight, not just for justice but for hope. This segment highlights the aftermath of James's release, the internal turmoil within the police department, and the growing public outcry. It sets the stage for James's transformation from victim to advocate, emphasizing the importance of collective action in the pursuit of justice. Weeks turned into months, and the city remained gripped by the fallout from James Thompson's arrest. What had started as a single incident of racial profiling and police misconduct had grown into something much larger, a movement for accountability, justice, and reform. The story of an innocent black man brutalized by a racist cop who didn't realize he was arresting his own boss captured national attention. It became a symbol of systemic issues that many had long ignored, but could no longer deny. James found himself at the center of it all, thrust into the spotlight in ways he never imagined. At first, the attention overwhelmed him. Cameras followed him everywhere, reporters hounded him with questions, and strangers approached him on the street to offer sympathy or share their own stories of injustice. Some praised him as a hero. Others criticized him for speaking out, accusing him of seeking fame or stirring division. But through it all, James stayed grounded, focusing on the bigger picture. He knew this wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been wronged by those sworn to protect them. The legal battle against Officer Mark Harris and the police department intensified. Evidence mounted against Harris, including video footage from bystanders, witness testimonies, and internal documents showing a pattern of misconduct. The tech company where James worked filed a formal lawsuit, not only on behalf of James, but also to demand sweeping reforms within the police force. They argued that what happened to James wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a broader culture of bias and abuse that needed to be dismantled. Harris, meanwhile, faced mounting pressure. Suspended without pay, he spent most of his days holed up in his apartment, avoiding public spaces for fear of being recognized. Friends and colleagues distanced themselves, unwilling to associate with someone whose actions had sparked such widespread outrage. His family tried to support him, but even they struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the officer seen in the videos, aggressive, unyielding, and cruel. Harris's once unshakable confidence crumbled under the weight of guilt and shame. For the first time in his life, he questioned whether he belonged in law enforcement at all. As the case moved toward trial, tensions escalated both inside and outside the courtroom. Protesters gathered daily outside the courthouse, holding signs and chanting slogans calling for justice. Local activists organized marches, drawing thousands of participants who marched peacefully through the streets. Social media campaigns amplified their message, reaching millions of people across the country. Hashtags like Justice for James and Reform Now trended for weeks, keeping the issue front and center in the public consciousness. Inside the courtroom, emotions ran high. James testified about the events of that fateful night, recounting every detail with clarity and composure. He described the fear he felt when Harris tackled him to the ground, the pain of the handcuffs cutting into his wrists, and the humiliation of being treated like a criminal despite doing nothing wrong. His voice trembled at times, but his determination never wavered. When asked why he chose to speak out, James replied simply, "Because I want to make sure no one else has to go through what I did." Witnesses corroborated James's account, painting a damning picture of Harris's behavior. One neighbor recounted how Harris ignored her protests during the arrest, while another recalled seeing the entire incident unfold and feeling powerless to intervene. Even some of Harris's fellow officers testified against him, admitting that his actions went far beyond standard protocol. Their testimonies revealed cracks in the so-called blue wall of silence, suggesting that not everyone was willing to defend misconduct anymore. Harris took the stand in his own defense, though his testimony did little to sway the jury. He claimed he acted out of concern for public safety, insisting that James fit the profile of someone potentially involved in illegal activity. But his explanations fell flat, undermined by inconsistencies in his story and the overwhelming evidence stacked against him. When pressed about why he continued to detain James even after discovering his identity, Harris stumbled over his words, unable to provide a satisfactory answer. By the end of his testimony, he looked defeated, his shoulders slumped and his face pale. Throughout the trial, James leaned heavily on his support system. Michael Carter, Sarah Miller, and other colleagues attended every hearing, standing beside him as a show of solidarity. Friends and family filled the courtroom seats, offering quiet encouragement whenever James needed it. Outside advocacy groups rallied around him, ensuring his voice reached audiences far beyond the confines of the legal proceedings. Together, they formed a network of strength and resilience, proving that even in the darkest moments, unity could light the way forward. The verdict came on a chilly autumn morning. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the judge entered and instructed the jury foreman to deliver their decision. James sat upright in his chair, hands clasped tightly together, bracing himself for whatever came next. When the foreman announced the words "guilty" on multiple charges, including excessive force and racial profiling, the room erupted in cheers. Tears streamed down James's face as he exhaled deeply, finally allowing himself to feel a sense of relief. Justice had been served, at least in part. For Harris, the verdict marked the beginning of the end. Stripped of his badge and sentenced to prison time, he disappeared from public view altogether. Rumors swirled about his whereabouts, but few cared enough to seek him out. To the world, he was a cautionary tale, a reminder of the consequences of unchecked power and prejudice. But for James, the fight was far from over. While the trial represented a victory, he knew true change required more than punishing one bad actor. It demanded systemic overhaul, better training for officers, stricter accountability measures, and greater transparency in policing practices. Inspired by the support he received, James dedicated himself to advocating for these changes. He partnered with organizations working to combat racial injustice, traveling across the country to share his story and push for policy reforms. He also returned to work, determined to use his platform for good. Under his leadership, the tech company launched initiatives aimed at fostering diversity and inclusion, both internally and externally. They invested in programs to educate employees about racial bias and collaborated with community leaders to develop tools promoting fairness in law enforcement. James's efforts earned him recognition not just as a victim-turned-advocate, but as a catalyst for positive transformation. Though scars remained, emotional wounds that might never fully heal, James refused to let bitterness consume him. Instead, he channeled his pain into purpose, emerging stronger and more resolute than ever before. As he looked toward the future, he carried with him a renewed sense of hope. Hope that someday, stories like his would be relics of the past. Hope that justice wouldn't have to come at such a great personal cost, and hope that together, humanity could build a world where everyone was treated with dignity and respect. This segment captures the culmination of the trial, its impact on both James and Harris, and sets the stage for James's ongoing advocacy work. It emphasizes themes of resilience, collective action, and the pursuit of lasting change, leaving readers inspired and reflective. The trial may have ended, but its ripple effects continued to shape the lives of everyone involved, and the community at large. For James Thompson, the verdict was a turning point, not just in his personal journey, but also in his role as an advocate for justice. What began as a harrowing experience had transformed him into a symbol of resilience and determination. Yet, he never saw himself as extraordinary. To James, he was simply someone who refused to stay silent when silence meant complicity. In the weeks following the trial, James threw himself into his advocacy work with renewed energy. He partnered with civil rights organizations, grassroots movements, and policy experts to push for meaningful reforms within law enforcement. His story resonated deeply with people across the country, drawing attention to systemic issues that many had long ignored or dismissed. James traveled extensively, speaking at conferences, town halls, and universities about the need for accountability, transparency, and empathy in policing. One of his most impactful initiatives was the creation of a training program designed to educate officers on implicit bias and cultural sensitivity. Working alongside psychologists, sociologists, and former law enforcement officials, James helped develop curriculum modules that emphasized de-escalation techniques over aggression. The goal was simple yet profound: to ensure that no one else would be treated the way he had been that fateful night. When the program launched, it received widespread acclaim, with several police departments adopting it voluntarily, a small but significant step toward change. Back in his hometown, the impact of James's efforts was undeniable. Protesters who had once filled the streets now channeled their energy into constructive action. Community meetings became forums for dialogue between residents and local authorities, fostering mutual understanding and collaboration. Slowly but surely, trust began to rebuild, brick by brick, conversation by conversation. It wasn't perfect, and progress was often frustratingly slow, but it was progress nonetheless. For Officer Mark Harris, life after the trial was unrecognizable. Stripped of his badge, convicted of multiple charges, and sentenced to prison, he disappeared from public view entirely. Behind bars, Harris faced the harsh reality of his choices. Fellow inmates recognized him from news reports, and some taunted him mercilessly, calling him the racist cop. Others avoided him altogether, leaving him isolated and friendless. Days turned into months, and Harris spent much of his time reflecting on the path that led him here. He thought about the countless interactions he'd had during his career, the moments when he could have chosen compassion over suspicion, patience over aggression. He realized how deeply ingrained his biases were, how they had clouded his judgment and cost him everything. In prison therapy sessions, Harris began confronting these truths, though it was painful and humbling. Whether this self-awareness would translate into genuine change remained uncertain, but for the first time, Harris acknowledged the harm he had caused, not just to James, but to countless others whose stories might never be told. Meanwhile, the tech company where James worked continued to play a pivotal role in driving reform. Under Michael Carter's leadership, the organization expanded its commitment to social responsibility. They established a fund dedicated to supporting victims of police brutality and funding research into innovative solutions for public safety. Employees rallied behind these efforts, volunteering their time and skills to contribute to projects aimed at creating safer, fairer communities. The company even hosted an annual summit bringing together activists, policymakers, and innovators to brainstorm ideas for systemic change. These events gained national recognition, further cementing the company's reputation as a force for good. James's colleagues noticed a shift in him too. While the trauma of his arrest still lingered, he carried himself with a quiet confidence, born of purpose. Colleagues admired his ability to channel pain into action, and many found inspiration in his unwavering optimism. Sarah Miller, who had played a key role in alerting the company to James's situation, became one of his closest allies. Together, they spearheaded internal diversity initiatives, ensuring that the workplace reflected the values they championed. Externally, their partnership proved invaluable, blending James's vision with Sarah's organizational skills to create lasting impact. As time passed, James learned to find peace in the midst of chaos. He reconnected with hobbies he had neglected during the darkest days, painting landscapes, playing guitar, and taking long walks through the park near his home. These small joys reminded him of the beauty in life, even amidst struggle. Friends and family marveled at his strength, but James credited them for helping him get through it all. "I couldn't have done any of this alone," he often said. "This fight belongs to all of us." The movement sparked by James's arrest grew beyond anything anyone could have predicted. Across the nation, similar cases came to light, encouraged by the precedent set in his trial. People emboldened by his courage stepped forward to share their own experiences, demanding justice and accountability. Lawmakers introduced bills aimed at addressing racial profiling and excessive use of force, citing James's case as evidence of the urgent need for reform. Activists celebrated each victory, no matter how small, knowing that every step forward brought them closer to a more equitable society. Yet James remained grounded in the knowledge that the work was far from over. True change required persistence, patience, and unity, qualities he embodied in everything he did. At a major rally held a year after his arrest, James stood before thousands of supporters, his voice steady and resolute. "We've come so far," he said, scanning the crowd. "But we can't stop now. Justice isn't just a destination, it's a journey. And we owe it to ourselves, to our children, and to future generations to keep moving forward." His words echoed through the square, met with thunderous applause. Tears glistened in the eyes of those gathered, a testament to the hope James inspired. As he stepped down from the stage, surrounded by friends, family, and fellow advocates, James felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't known was possible. This wasn't the life he had planned for himself, but it was the life he chose to embrace. A life dedicated to making the world better than he found it. Years later, historians would look back on this moment as a turning point in the fight against systemic racism and police brutality. James Thompson's name would appear in textbooks, documentaries, and speeches, not as a victim but as a catalyst for change. And while he never sought fame or recognition, James knew his legacy would endure, not because of what happened to him, but because of what he did about it, because sometimes the hardest battles yield the greatest victories, and sometimes the smallest acts of courage spark revolutions. This final segment ties together the themes of resilience, collective effort, and the pursuit of justice. It leaves readers with a sense of hope and inspiration, emphasizing that while the road to equality is long, every step counts.